that any even young child could understand. The problem that mankind does with that is that they then take that possibility and they want to, create rules and other laws and principles associated with it. They want to say it's only available to the holy and not to the unholy. And they want to come up with all of these
to control it.
But of course it will not be able to be controlled. The reality is that each individual has the ability to communicate with God directly, and that being the case, surely has the ability to understand the language of that communication. And it would also make sense that that language of communication with God is independent of earth-based languages. In other words, I don't have to communicate with God in English. I don't have to communicate with God in French or Spanish or some other language. It would also make sense that the intellect is not going to be perhaps the entire means of communicating with God, because the intellect always has limitations. We have limitations of understanding. Also, the intellect cannot convey a lot of information that God could convey. Now, let me illustrate how that is the case. When the two of you entered a relationship, there were feelings that you transmitted to each other through that relationship. Yes. Some of those feelings had words associated with them, yes?
Yes.
But some of the feelings had no words associated with them.
Didn't make sense.
It didn't even make sense, but you felt it from each other.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
You felt a feeling from each other. Now, how do you create a communication method that conveys the feeling through thought? It's very hard, isn't it? It's like saying how do you define love as a thought? See, most people would say love is a lot of people do say love is a thought, but actually love is more than a thought, because it has an emotion associated.
You have an experience within the.
That's correct.
Definitely.
Yeah. So there are feelings that unless you can feel them, you're never really going to understand them with thought. It's a bit like trying to describe to a 9-year-old child what it's like to fall in love. When they get to be 14 or 15, they fall in love for the first time, and all of a sudden they know what it's like to fall in love. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Some of the spirit friends are saying too, so that means then too, regardless of whether we're here or we've passed, this same process is actually going to be there.
Exactly. So it makes sense though, if you look at it, that the intellect is actually a very, very limited form of communication. Yeah. And God's form of communication, or God's language with us, if you like to call it, could not be limited by the intellect. It has to be more than the intellect. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it would make sense that it is more than the intellect. And when I thought about these things in the first century, I realised that God's language of communication had to involve the feelings and emotions of the individual rather than just the intellect. It might encompass the intellect, but would not just include the intellect only.
Yeah.
And I also realised by my observance of the religious formats that were around me at the time that many people used their intellect, but their feelings were completely the opposite of what they were saying in their intellect.
So we say one thing when we're projecting another thing out.
Yes. So we say one thing when we're feeling something quite different. And I realised if God was the all-powerful creator that I imagined God to be at the time, of course I didn't know God to be that at the time, I just imagined God to be that at the time, and I realised that God would be able to easily see the difference between a thought that is imagined or real and the emotion, the true feelings of the individual. And so I realised after that actually it's the emotional feeling side of the individual had to be the primary way in which we communicate with God.
Is that because that's our true self, the emotion?
Well, yeah, at the time I didn't consider it to be necessarily the true self. I just thought that the reality is, from what I observed around me, was that many people were falsifying their true self with many people. When I say falsifying their true self, what I meant was that many people around me were saying one thing out of their mouth, which obviously came from their intellect, but at the same time feeling something quite different from their emotions, which I began to see as something completely different in terms of the person. So I started to see at the time that the intellect which I now know to be a part of the spirit body's mind. But back then I hadn't discovered that at this point. I just started seeing the intellect as a very limited ability, with a very, very limited ability to accurately communicate information to another human, let alone to God.
Yep.
Yeah.
Then I also thought about the potential, well, that's about our communication with God. What about God's communication with us?
Yeah.
And it would make sense, if you think about it, that God's communication method with us would have to also involve feelings and emotions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Rather than just thoughts, because thoughts are limited. So how does God give you the sense that you're loved by giving you a thought? It's very, very hard.
Yeah.
Right? How do you give your child a sense that she is loved?
Yeah, it's not a thought.
By a
what
thought.
we-
You
yeah.
can't, do you?
Yeah.
It's by what we do and actually how we share.
Exactly. It's
How
by
you
what
interact
you
with
do,
them.
how you act, but also how you express yourself in terms of your feelings to your child. So if you're saying to your child, I love you, and at the same time in a rage with your child, the child's not going to feel any sense of love from you.
No.
Right? And if you say, I love you, but all the time you're totally distracted whenever the child is nearby, and you're totally disconnected from the child in any way in terms of projection of that feeling, then of course the child is not going to feel that you love them. It's just the words to them that mean nothing. And so at that time I started experimenting with this concept. So I'd use my intellect logically to determine the fact that yes, I felt that there was a God that existed because of what I saw in creation, although I did see distortions in creation of love, which I couldn't imagine being God, but I had no explanation for that at the time. But secondly, I started to examine the intellect and its limited capacity to communicate. So I realised that the intellect had a limited capacity to communicate true feelings, even between humans, let alone between a human and another being. And then I realised that if the natural way of a very young child was to feel rather than think, then it would make sense, and God would naturally have a way of communicating with a young child, then it would make sense that the way God communicates is via these feelings rather than thoughts.
So with the young child, that's when they're hungry, they feel hungry. It's when they're uncomfortable, they're feeling uncomfortable rather than thinking.
And before they can even speak,
Yeah.
they're already in the feeling. And if you can sense the feeling, you know when to feed them. And in fact, now a lot of mothers have realised that they can actually feel when their child has to go to the toilet. And instead of just, they actually put their child on the toilet, and fair enough, the child goes and they don't need to worry about nappies as much anymore because they can already feel when the child has feelings about what they want to do rather than, something that they have to verbally state to the mother. And once I realised and saw all of this occurring, I started experimenting with the idea that I could feel things towards God, which God would be able to hear, if you like, through God's feelings.
Yep.
And God would be able to feel things from me, and I would be able to hear, if we could use it in quotation marks, those feelings by actually feeling them rather than... In other words, I could feel God's feelings and God could feel my feelings.
Okay. I don't know if it's appropriate but I want to ask about how did you recognise that? That might be a bit later. I don't know.
Well, obviously, when I first started experiencing that, I didn't understand whose feelings were what. So, were they my feelings or God's feelings? Or, it was hard to determine because I had never really experimented with this before. I started to connect with my own feelings, but it was difficult to know where your external feelings were coming from. And so what I started to do is experimenting with feelings that I could sense from other people first.
Yeah.
So I started sensing, through this development of this, I started feeling whether I, using my intellect to actually experiment with feeling other people. And then I would ask them what they felt. And if they were an honest person, very frequently exactly what I felt from them was what they were feeling at the time.
Yeah.
And then I started realising that actually I could very accurately feel what people were feeling. And it was a very different feeling to what I had inside of myself about the same subject.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then I realised that I could try the same experiments with God. So I spent quite a lot of time alone, even as a young child, So by this stage I was 9 or 10 years of age and starting to experiment with my relationship with God by feeling for God. Before then I had feelings about God that I didn't experiment with on a conscious level, but by this stage in my life I started experimenting with them on a conscious level. In other words, going through a process of experimentation to see whether I could feel God's feelings and so forth. And what I started recognising was there was a consistency in my ability to feel or sense certain things from God. And with the feeling, I realised all these thoughts came as well, but they were thoughts generated not by any external creation.
So is this after the feeling? Or
after I had the feeling, then it would resolve a lot of my questions instantly without anybody telling me the resolution of those questions. So I started feeling that, all I've got to do is allow these feelings coming from God. As I allowed these feelings coming from God, I started realising that I could now get information about all sorts of other things because these feelings seemed to open up a capacity in me to understand everything that I couldn't previously understand.
Can you give an example?
Certainly, I can give a lot of examples perhaps. For example, when I was very, very young, I used to try to understand the role of insects I was fascinated, as most children are, fascinated by insects, right? So I would try to understand the role of insects. Now, insects have very, very complex symbiotic roles with the rest of nature. And of course, because of their complexity, it's very, very difficult for a child to understand, right? So, but what I found was if I communicated with God and I realised after a while that if I longed for the feeling from God to understand this particular thing, and also longed for God's love for God's love, and the way I saw it at the time was not so much longing for God's love, but longing for this connection with God, maintain.
So in that process, it's a desire to know rather than you were actually wanting to know what's going on rather than...
Yeah, I wanted to know other things too, but I primarily focused on my desire for God and my desire to feel God. Yeah. But I realised that if I had any questions at the same time about other things that were around me, through this connection, whenever I felt God's feelings for me, I started to be able to know the answer to the question.
It was just the answer was there.
The answer was there. So I started discovering the relationship between certain insects and certain plants and what happened and why they were there. And it was not scientific knowledge that was easily available at the time. You had to go to people who were very learned men, usually quite aged, in different countries other than where I lived. He spent their whole lifetime learning about it. And yet, all of a sudden, I knew. Wow. And this became quite an amazing process for me to experiment with then. I started realising that I didn't actually need to be educated by anybody, because God had the ability to educate me through this connection about everything, not just about God, but also about everything else. Of course, for me, the primary education that I was attempting to receive was about God, because that was the thing that fascinated me the most. Yep. But I found as a subsequent result of the communication with God, and the communication wasn't verbal, and the communication wasn't thoughts. It was this emotional feelings going back and forth between myself and God that I could feel for God and I could feel from God. And as I received those feelings, other things became very, very, I knew them all of a sudden. And then sometimes I would experiment with what I knew, of course, to find out whether it was just a knowledge, whether it was a practical knowledge, or whether it was just a theory.
So that's a good suggestion for all of us to do as well.
Yeah. So what I finished up doing was entering this, what I would call a feeling-based dialogue with God, which became for me a permanent thing. So I was constantly, before I talked to anybody else, I would talk to God. In fact, frequently I wouldn't talk to anybody else. I would just talk to God. My father, even when I was very young age, like 3 or 4 years of age, my father was very concerned, because I would even speak to God out loud as I was doing these other things, even by that age. And he would wonder why I'm talking to myself all the time and what's going on, and he was quite concerned, and he would talk to my mum Mary about it, and she would say, "It's all right, it's a passing phase, you know, like you'll get over that."
He's a boy.
You'll get over that. And then when I'm 9 or 10 and I'm still doing it, my father's now getting really worried because it wasn't such a passing phase as he wanted it to be. And I continued that dialogue through my entire life. And when I was alone, quite often I would speak openly with God out loud. But when I was with other people, I started realising that it seemed to distress them quite a lot. So
is the start here, when you have a question, is it feeling how you're feeling within yourself first? Is that like the first thing to do or not?
Well, the problem with using this method is that you have to be sensitive to your own feelings first. And what I realised through this process was that not many people were actually sensitive to their own feelings. A lot of times they didn't even know.
So we're not honest even with actually how we're feeling.
Yeah. So, you know, quite often a person would say they loved somebody when they actually hated them. Quite often the person would say that they were, you know, that they were happy when they looked actually quite sad, and you could feel their sadness. Quite often you know, a person was acted like they were fearless, but you could see all the fear in them. You'll feel all the fear in them. Once I went through this experiment of feeling people first. So I started realising that a lot of people actually thought they felt certain things, but they didn't feel them. And that is obviously a problem. If you can't feel what you actually feel, then how are you also going to feel something that is transmitted to you from another? Whether that person is an individual on earth or in the spirit world or God herself. So I realised that it was very, very important to actually understand your own feelings. And so I spent a lot of time in the first century, and even I do the same in this life, understanding my own feelings, trying to get some kind of, firstly trying to feel them so I know what they are, and then of course once you feel them you can understand them. Now most people on earth have been taught to heavily use their intellect. So most people are on earth, unfortunately, quite their feelings and their thoughts are very separate from each other. And so the method of communication with God is quite difficult then, because they think they're having a feeling that they're not actually having. Now, if I can give you an example of that. Quite a lot of people on earth are in a rage with God. Even people who are in religions, many of them are in a rage with God.
So the rage is the blame to God?
Yeah, they blame God for all sorts of things that have happened in their life. They feel God's to blame, and God hasn't helped them, and God hasn't made them safe, and God hasn't done all of these different things. So they're quite angry. So many people who you would say, do you love God? They go, yes, I love God and I believe in God. And yet at the same time they're in a rage with God. Now, what I realised in the first century is that love and rage are two very, very different emotions, right? And you can't have one and the other together in the same person at the same time.
So wherever you're in a rage, you're not going to have a connection with God?
Well, no. That's the other thing I learned, is that you had to just be truthful with your emotion with God.
So own the fact that I am
in a rage,
okay.
And then you could still maintain your connection with God. You could still feel the connection with God if you did this. And this is one thing that I learned as well, the importance of a truthful reflection of your emotional condition with God. So in other words, if I am in a rage with God, feel my rage with God.
And that's okay.
That's what God wants you to
that's
feel, because you're in a rage with God. And then you have a chance to get to the underlying fear that you have that creates the rage, and then the underlying grief that creates the fear. And what I found through that process was that actually God wanted us to be real.
Yep. Be ourselves.
Not fake.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which of course makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, why would God want to connect with somebody who's being fake? You know?
And that's going to answer then that I wanted to ask about if you're in such denial and you're not even feeling it, like you've convinced yourself that you're not in a rage with God, then it's through that same process you've been describing that you're actually going to discover that you actually are in a rage with God.
Yes.
And until you go through that, you're
Yes.
not even going to know.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what happens on earth, unfortunately, is most people begin by not being able to feel God or even feel themselves to a large degree. Now, what needs to happen first is a person needs to learn how to feel themselves.
Yes.
When they can learn how to feel themselves, then they'll feel their actual feelings that they have about God. And once they feel their actual feelings about God, they can start expressing them. So, for example, a scientist who did that, who doesn't believe in God, would say, look, God, I don't even believe in you. That's my feelings. You've not proven yourself to me, you've not shown yourself to me, And you can even enter a dialogue with God saying that you don't believe in God,
Yeah.
right? And find in the end a connection with God through that process, right? But what I feel happens a lot of times on earth is that we go through this process where we have the feeling, like, and then we believe the feeling as truth. When I say believe the feeling as truth, we believe it as the ultimate truth. So, for example, I have a feeling inside of me that God never protected me.
Yeah.
I asked for God to protect me. Let's say as a child I believed in a God and I asked for God to protect me through some hard processes or things that happened to me, and God never protected me from those particular things, and so I came to believe that God didn't care about me or there was no God as a result of that particular event.
Yep.
Now, unfortunately, for most people, when they become an adult like that, they then assume that that belief is true, when there could have been circumstances that would explain why a person couldn't communicate with us at that particular time or connect with us at that particular time. There might have been principles or other things involved that we are not aware of at the time. So what I'm saying is we need to be truthful about our emotional condition as it is currently with God.
Yep.
But that's how we open this dialogue with God. And if we're in a rage with God, we express this rage.
So for most of us, we're either going to be in a rage or we're going to have this enormous amount of grief currently.
For most there's an enormous amount of anger with God.
Yeah.
There is also quite a lot of fear with God for most people, because in their childhood most people were told that if you didn't do the right thing, God would punish you.
Yeah.
And so there is this common concept on earth that God is a punishing God. And so many people in earth, even in religions, walk around with a lot of fear about God. They believe God is going to come along at some point and punish them for their wickedness. So they are very, very tentative about experimenting with anything. And they also feel that anything that is, slightly out of line might be wicked. So they even try to not do that, but their heart's telling them to do it. And then they get into this convoluted mess in terms of guilt and self-punishment and so forth, which is religiously often accepted as okay, as a part of the holy process. And unfortunately we end up with this mess of emotions that we have towards God, which we don't express because we're so afraid of God.
We're terrified about the thought of letting them out.
Yeah, exactly. And so many of us are quite shut down in our relationship with God. We view God like a very angry, overbearing parent who has the potentially to fly off the handle at the drop of a hat, and as the saying goes. And so we have this viewpoint that I've just got to make one little mistake and God's got to be on me.
So running around being really good all the time, or trying to be good.
Or we go to the extent of going, oh, blow that, and often we use a lot more severe language than that, right? And we go, I'm not going to do that anymore.
I'm going to rebel for the rest of my life.
If God's like that, I don't want to have any part of him. And then we go into total rebellion and go in completely the opposite direction often. So we end up with this experiences on earth where people are either living in what they believe to be in harmony with God or God's laws or principles, often because they're so terrified of God, or they go down a totally rebelling against God and saying there is no God or anything else because of the rage and anger that exists in them from their childhood.
So that's why talking about God makes so many of us uncomfortable. It's this experience we've had of religious people, especially when we're young, sharing their beliefs around God that make us cringe.
Well, unfortunately, though, it's even deeper than that. The main reason why we have so much discomfort associated with God is because of what happened during our childhood with our parents.
Yep.
You see, God is often associated, all of the emotional injuries and feelings that we have with our parents are imposed upon God. So if my mother was a bit aloof and didn't take much interest in me, I feel that the feminine side of God is aloof and doesn't take much interest in her children. If my father was the one who came home with a strap whenever I was disobedient, then I start imposing the idea upon God that the daddy side of God, if you like, the father side of God, is going to punish me for every mistake I make, and any time I disagree with him. and so we have these very distorted concepts of God by a very young age, not necessarily because we've been taught them verbally, but because of the interaction we've had with our parents and with any other religious system. Yep. And, on the earth, there are very large religious systems that have a large amount of impact upon people's lives. So therefore, there is a very, very strong indication of whether God exists or doesn't exist in a family, and also what God's character and nature is. Bearing in mind, of course, that the parents don't know what God's character and nature is. They've just gone through exactly the same process themselves with another set of parents who believed they knew, who did not know, because they hadn't connected with God either.
So that's why from a very young age we just start ignoring God straight away.
Often we either ignore God or we're so afraid of God that we do everything we believe God wants us to do. Yeah. Either way is often very out of harmony with communication with God.
Yeah.
Right. So God wants us in the end, if you experiment with this, and this is the beauty too. If we do this in this manner, we are now independent of any teacher that would ever come across our path.
So it's up to us.
It's up to us, and this would make sense too, that all of humanity was created equal. Yep. Since all of humanity was created equal, all of us have an equal capacity to have a personal relationship with God. Therefore, we do not need a priest. We do not need a prophet. None of us need any of these things. We all have the personal ability to communicate with God directly, because God established that ability is a part of his creation of us. Just like when we have a child, the ability for language is a part of the child's nature, so we can communicate and eventually establish a language, a form of communication between us and the child. And while language is a very limited form of communication, because it's usually only intellectual and verbal, it does have words that express emotions, but usually if a person feels the emotion, you really don't need the words. And this is why you can, talk to someone who's a Portuguese, and you can see when he's angry, you can see when he's sad, and you can see when he's afraid, and you can see all of these things, and he doesn't have to say a word, because there is this other language, which I would call the language of the soul, which is a far more effective method of communication, because it tells us exactly how a person feels.
And that's what we're actually using when we're communicating with God. It's coming through our soul.
Well, that's what we have to use to communicate with God. There is no other way of communicating with God without involving that. And this is where I feel most people make the mistake. They believe that they can communicate with God intellectually without their feelings being involved. And without their real self being engaged.
So with that though, so all our feelings come from our soul. Is that what we're saying?
Not necessarily. We remember we can have feelings that come from within us and go out to people outside or to God. But we can also have feelings that enter our soul that come from outside of us and enter us, that we allow to enter us. So this is how, if I'm in love with if I'm in love with Mary, I can feel my love for her. I can also feel the times when she loves me. Yep. Because that's a feeling that's external to myself, that that I'm open to allowing enter me, and so it enters me, and so I can feel it from her without her saying anything. And it's the same principle with our communication with God. So not all feelings come from just within us, so we're all capable of transmitting feelings. And so you could say that every feeling has the ability to be transmitted and received, just like an electronic signal has the ability to be transmitted and received, and just like our thoughts have the ability to be transmitted and received. But when we have all of those things happening at the same time, our thoughts and our feelings in complete harmony, now we have a lot of power in the transmission, and therefore in the reception.
So the strength, we strengthen the whole accuracy of what we're going to get back.
Yes. So if I, as a parent, was yelling at my child and telling them that I loved them, so I love you, you silly idiot, that type of thing, which a lot of parents do, right?
Yeah.
Not quite in that language, often swearing at them at the same time.
I love you, but go to bed.
I love you, but... Or even they're angry while they're saying, I love you, right? How dare you do that? I love you, when there's just rage coming from the person. Then the child is feeling completely two separate things. Yeah. They're feeling the feeling dominantly, and then the thought, causes them intellectual confusion generally. Like, this doesn't feel like love to me, so you're telling me, so inside of the child basically what's going on is you're telling me that when you're yelling at me, you're loving me.
Wow.
And so they then start, there's a lot of confusion now in terms of between the feeling and the thought.
And we've got this for the rest of our life until we open up to it.
Yeah, exactly. Until we understand that the reason why we're so confused is that what we were told was very different to what we felt. Once we have the ability to accurately relay every single time the same thing as we think and feel, so in other words, what I feel is what I verbally say at the same time.
Yep.
Once that happens, now the person on the receiving end is in no doubt as to my feelings and thoughts. Because now the emotion and the thought are in harmony with each other. One thing we need to